Good evening and welcome. Good evening to this wonderful crowd and welcome to Knollwood Baptist Church. My name is Catherine Martin and I'm Minister of Faith Formation and Education here at Knollwood Baptist. It is my true pleasure to welcome you to our sanctuary for a conversation with Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the BJC. Welcome to a timely discussion of Christian nationalism, the roots of this dangerous ideology, and the present reality of who and what it harms. In conversation with scholar and professor Dr. Bill Leonard, Amanda Tyler will share how she drew on experiences, research, scripture, and her Baptist convictions to write her new book, How to End Christian Nationalism. After the program, right outside the sanctuary in the narthex, copies of the book will be on sale, and Amanda will be signing books. And should you need a restroom or a water fountain, those are located right off of the narthex. Knollwood Baptist Church is deeply grateful to fellow faith communities Ardmore Baptist and First Baptist on Fifth for the partnership that enabled this evening's program to take place. Responding faithfully to the rise of Christian nationalism and conscientiously defending religious freedom is vital work that is best done in community. So we are thankful for each one of you here tonight, whether you know a lot or not much about Christian nationalism. As people of faith or of no particular faith, and whatever your worldview or point of view, you are welcome here and warmly invited to listen and learn along with us. And now Dr. Bob Setzer, pastor of Knollwood, will offer some more Baptist context.
I was asked to tell you all a little bit about Knollwood's long connection to the Baptist Joint Committee, which Amanda now directs. And that took me very quickly back to James Dunn. If you don't know who James Dunn is, you haven't been at this very long. I was looking about 15 years ago at the possibility of coming here when I learned that James Dunn was a member of this congregation. That's back when he was teaching at Wake Div with his old sidekick, Bill Leonard, and had just finished his storied career at the Baptist Joint Committee. But when I learned that Bill Leonard was a member of this church, I knew I was good to go, because it had to be the freedom-loving kind of Baptist. Because that fierce partisan of religious liberty and its constitutional protections, of course, the separation of church and state, James Dunn would not be the member of any kind of church that didn't have freedom as its heartbeat. He and Marilyn were much beloved by this congregation, but I have to be honest, James was not always popular with everyone in this congregation. Because when it came to taking on threats to our God-breathed First Amendment rights, he was always as fierce and uncompromising as the most craggy Old Testament prophet, from Amos to Elijah to Obadiah. And even before Christian nationalism, that most insidious and ridiculous of oxymorons, even before Christian nationalism became the highly organized public movement it is today, James called it out as a threat to our democracy. He was calling out Christian nationalism long before it was cool. As he wryly observed on many occasions, the problem with a theocracy is everybody wants to be Theo. And as we all know, the proponents of Christian nationalism have a very clear idea of who gets to be Theo, and that would be them. Thanks to James Dunn, this church's long and historic ties to the Baptist Joint Committee were deeply strengthened and broadened. The Baptist Joint Committee was and is a top-tier mission partner of our church. It receives as many of our mission dollars to external mission partners as any other entity. Because we are passionate about our Baptist freedoms, and not just for us, God knows, but for all Americans. And that's why we are grateful for a new generation of leaders such as Amanda Tyler, who continue to hone and refine the Baptist witness to freedom of religion and freedom from religion, especially the government-sanctioned kind. So it is Knollwood's great joy and privilege to host this pivotally important conversation between Bill and Amanda. And we're so grateful to our mission partners, First on Fifth and Ardmore Baptist, for helping to make it possible. So thank you for being here. Listen up. It'll be a perhaps raucous, but certainly enlightening and engaging conversation.
My name is Emily Hull-McGee. I serve as pastor at First Baptist Church on Fifth. And my first introduction to the intersection of faith and the public square came, like many students at the Divinity School at Wake Forest did, through the Texas drawl of our beloved friend, Dr. James Dunn. As a pivotal leader in Washington and executive director of the BJC, Dr. Dunn had developed, let's just say, an opinion or two about the role of a Christian to interact with politics. To any student who voiced a questioning word as if they'd never really thought exactly about how to be Christian in public, Dr. Dunn would declare with the kind of intensity informed by years of yelling at politicians that it is indeed faithful and just and good and necessary for our faith to inform our posture in the public square. His voice has remained in my ear and my heart ever since, and my story is one of many who would share the same. Yet in a thrilling way, this new generation of leadership has picked up the vision and vigor of lions like Dr. Dunn and is now carrying the mantle of faith freedom for all, teaching the rest of us how this posture adjusts as the context changes. One of its visionaries, one of our Baptist visionaries, is Amanda Tyler. Since she was announced as executive director in 2016, Amanda Tyler has served as the executive director of BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, leading the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principles of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by the government. She is the lead organizer of BJC's Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. She co-hosts the BJC's Respecting Religion podcast and is the newly published author of How to End Christian Nationalism, which has been out in the world for a week. We give her a round of applause for that. Tyler's constitutional law analysis and advocacy for faith freedom for all have been featured on many major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and MSNBC, the latter network on which you may have seen her on Sunday night being interviewed. Named by Religion News Service as one of 2022's rising stars in religion, Amanda Tyler is a member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar with extensive experience working in Congress, in private legal practice, and serving as a law clerk for a federal judge. She testified before Congress in 2023 on the threats of Christian nationalism to religious liberty. And her 2022 testimony before Congress discussed the ways that Christian nationalism proves cover for white supremacy. In 2018, she appeared before a U.S. Senate committee to testify about the threats to religious liberty around the world. She's originally from Austin, Texas. And Amanda grew up hearing about the cherished Baptist principles of religious liberty and the separation of church and state as a member of Highland Park Baptist Church. Because she was committed to those principles, she sought out BJC when moving to Washington to attend Georgetown University, began volunteering in the office, and later to be hired by BJC to serve as assistant to the general counsel, and look at her now. Amanda graduated magna cum laude from the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University with a bachelor's degree in foreign service and with honors from the University of Texas School of Law with a Juris Doctor. She lives in Dallas with her husband and their son and is a member at Royal Lane Baptist Church. Today, Amanda will be in conversation with Dr. Bill Leonard, another of the visionaries to help us all make sense of our history and our world. Dr. Leonard is the founding dean and professor of divinity emeritus of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity. Dr. Leonard is the preeminent scholar of American religious history in our country, with particular interest in Baptist studies and Appalachian religion. You may have one of his 25 books that he has written. I know I do. But if not, perhaps you should get one to have a taste of Dr. Leonard's unique voice that mixes head and heart and humor alike, perhaps picking up his most recent book titled The Homebrewed Christianity's Guide to Church History, Flaming Heretics and Heavy Drinkers. Dr. Leonard is on the board of the Journal of Disability and Religion, the Baptist Quarterly, the Day One Preaching Network, and the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues. He writes a twice-monthly column for Baptist News Global. He's an ordained Baptist minister and is a member with his family at First Baptist Church on Highland Avenue here in Winston-Salem. I'm so lucky that Amanda and Bill are my friends and mentors and colleagues and guides. It is such a delight to introduce them to you tonight. Amanda and Bill, we hear you gladly.
Good evening. We're glad that you are here, and we want to jump into this important issue right away. So I have read Amanda's book. It's quite wonderful, it's quite informative, and it's extremely important for this very moment in this country. And I hope all of you will buy it, and if we run out, call Amazon the moment you get home. I've moved through the chapters, and we've talked about some particular things we wanted to start with, so I'm going to begin by simply saying, Amanda, at the beginning of the book, you define Christian nationalism and the myth of America as a Christian nation. Please talk with us about what that involves and where that is taking us now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I always think it's important to start with definitions, because especially on a topic as charged, complicated, and misunderstood as Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. And it's a subset of a larger phenomenon of religious nationalism, which has been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. And, American exceptionalism, this other idea that there's something special, unique, and different about the United States story, that's part of Christian nationalism. But when it comes to Christian nationalism, America's not, and religious nationalism in particular, America's not unique, America's not exceptional, right? But the particular brand of Christian nationalism in the United States context, I think, does have some particular aspects to it. And so while I want us to think about a global religious nationalism, I think just to kind of put it into context, much of what we discussed tonight, I think, is going to be about American Christian nationalism. So American Christian nationalism also suggests that to be a real American, a true American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political priorities. And so I think it's important to note Christian nationalism is not just an ideology and a framework, but also a highly organized political movement that is gaining force at this particular time. Christian nationalism is also a very old problem. In the world context, I think we can date Christian nationalism all the way back to Constantine.
Yes.
The first time that an empire took the religion of Christianity on as its own and then used all the force of that empire to impose the religion on everyone else, often through violent means and through creating systems of us versus them, which is also a key part of what breeds Christian nationalism. But as the name suggests, Christian nationalism also relies heavily on this mythological founding of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation, not in a demographic sense, but rather in a sense that it was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. It also has a heavy emphasis on the idea that God's providential hand is guiding America through history, that God has a special role for the United States in God's plan for the world, that God loves America best. God bless America, right? So there are aspects of civil religion that also overlap with Christian nationalism, and it's problematic for a number of reasons, some of them theological. The Gospel of John says, in its most quoted and memorized verse, "For God so loved the world." It doesn't say, "For God so loved the United States." But that's the story that Christian nationalism tells. And then, of course, it's also problematic because it doesn't align with a more honest and fulsome reading of American history, particularly constitutional history. Because the framers of the US Constitution made a very deliberate choice to disestablish religion from government, learning from the colonial past and the problems with established religion, problems for democracy, yes, but also problems for religion itself. And so they made a choice in the founding document, the US Constitution, which is a secular document, to separate the institutions of religion and government, to in fact make sure we did not have a Christian nation in the sense that that's often talked about, but rather a religious freedom nation, a nation where one's belonging would not depend on one's identity, one's religious identity or how one worships. The problem, of course, being that promise, that constitutional promise of religious freedom for all has not been fully realized, in part because of the recurrence and the staying power of this ideology of Christian nationalism.
Those who came to this country often spoke, many of the Puritans particularly who came to New England. There was a church state, an established church among Anglicans in Virginia and in the South, and among the Puritans, particularly in Massachusetts and New England. And they often spoke of the land to which they had come as with such terms as Redeemer Nation, God's new Israel, chosen nation. And that got passed on extensively through a variety of particularly Protestant denominations. So many of the early colonies were in themselves little religious establishments that were essentially, or tried to be, theocracies. That leads us to another question. Christian nationalism is often referred to as white Christian nationalism. And so race is in many ways inseparable from the Christian nationalist mentality, particularly in the early days of America with slavery and the way in which many, particularly Southerners, use the Bible to defend that practice. But now, in many ways, it's focused on immigrants. Talk about that as you pursue it in the book.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely critical that we talk about how Christian nationalism overlaps with white supremacy. And I really, writing the book comes out of more than 5 years of leadership of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, talking about Christian nationalism in all kinds of groups. And when we started the campaign, we started it with this statement in the kind of central piece of Christians Against Christian Nationalism that says, Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And when I first started writing the book, I had a separate chapter that was just about white supremacy and racism. And you won't find that chapter in here anymore, because as I wrote it, I thought, this is running through the entire understanding of what Christian nationalism is. It's not a discrete piece of it, it's completely part of what American Christian nationalism is. In the book, I also talk with and interview a number of different people who are working on the issue, and one of them is a scholar of religion and religious history, Dr. Anthea Butler, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. And I asked her the question in the book, how do you see that Christian nationalism overlaps with white supremacy? And or provides cover for white supremacy. And she paused, and I write about this piece, and I started to get nervous. And I said, well, do you see that? And she said, not really. She said, I think for those of us who are Black, we see it as a signpost at the door. We don't see that it provides cover, we just see it as white supremacy in American Christianity. And that moment, I included kind of my own awakening in that moment in the book, because I think it shows that particularly as white Christians, we are continuing to wake up to our own privilege in this area, how we have been privileged by white Christian nationalism in this country in ways that are sometimes hard for us even to understand, even those of us who are actively working to dismantle it. And so how I understand it is, and it goes back to this history, is that mythology of America as a Christian nation, it also says that the only people who are really worthy of full citizenship rights in this country are the same people who held power at the beginning of the country, the same people who were granted those full citizenship rights in the original Constitution, which were really white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. Those were the only people who were full Americans at the beginning, and everyone else had some lesser citizenship status accordingly. Some people had no rights, of course, and were held as property as enslaved people. And so we have to understand that has an effect on a people. That those roots of our history have really meant that we are still dealing, if we are brave enough, we are still dealing with the repercussions of that today. And so to really face white Christian nationalism, we also have to face the racism that's inherent. And that gets, talk about a current issue. 2 nights ago, we watched a rally at Madison Square Garden, which talked about Americans as garbage, which talked about having migrants kicked out of the country. We're talking about people in ways that are dehumanizing and are all loaded with all kinds of coded racist language, xenophobic language, and that is being propagated in part by reliance on Christian language, Christian symbols, with Christianity itself. And this isn't a new problem, just as you talked about the Puritans. Our ancestors in the faith allowed their theology to be misused, abused, distorted out of recognition in service of power in the past. A doctrine of discovery, which is this deadly heresy, and was this deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal this land from native peoples. That was when we first started seeing this seeping Christian nationalism infect our American Christianity in ways that have pulled us away from the teachings of Jesus. And we have to reckon with that as we face the modern implications, including the abject racism and othering that we're seeing in our modern discourse.
Thomas Dixon, a graduate of Wake Forest College, Baptist minister, writes 2 books in the early 20th century, one called The Leopard Spots and the other called The Klansman, which became a text for the infamous movie The Birth of a Nation. And he ties white supremacy to the KKK.
Right.
And the need under God to resist what he calls mulatto Christianity, meaning interracial Christianity, as opposed to thoroughly white biology. So it's a long history in the country. Amanda, you had a quote that just jumped out at me around chapter 7 or so, and I'll read it tonight. By merging the almighty power of God with the earthly power of the state, we reduce the sacred to the secular. When an empire claims for itself the mantle of sacred legitimacy, Christians must confront it by speaking the truth to power. Elaborate on that amazing and very important quote.
Well, I think this was the chapter where I'm really encouraging people to take an active place in the public square, and giving examples of how some of our political leaders have confused their callings in the public square to serve all people in our democracy who have elected them with some kind of religious ordination, right? And the example that I give is the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. I just happened, pure coincidence, to be testifying on Capitol Hill the day that he was sworn in and took over leadership as Speaker of the House. And so I was watching very intently that day when he gave his speech, and in his speech accepting, really assuming that leadership role to be second in line to the presidency, to lead the most democratic institution that we have in this country, in the U.S. House of Representatives, he said that it was his belief that every person in that chamber had been ordained to their position by God. And in that moment, he tried to take what was a secular democratic institution and turn it into a religious one. And he violated, I believe, the free and fair votes of every American who were voting for their rights to be represented there and not to be part of a religious body. He also violated the religious freedom rights of the elected officials sitting in that place, not all of whom share his belief that they were ordained by God to serve in some religious role in that place. And so I think it is so incumbent on all Americans to be actively involved in the democratic process that we have here. And that for those of us who are people of faith, whatever faith tradition that is, that we bring our faith to bear in our public advocacy in ways that Dr. Dunn would have told us to do as well, but that we do it in ways that don't insist that our positions be reflected in law and policy. We aren't about setting up a theocracy that just happens to be how we would run things. We are about advocating for a pluralistic democracy that represents everyone's interests, regardless of religion. And we can exercise the full limits of our religious freedom rights by making sure that our religion is animating the work that we do in the public square. But we have to be careful about the ways that we talk about the work that we're doing. I get uncomfortable, I will say, when I hear about our rights as Americans being called sacred rights. I think we're sometimes a little fast and loose with the language of our religious language when we're talking about our democratic rights as Americans in ways that can be confusing, right? And so I want to point out an example like Speaker Johnson saying, you know, we're all ordained to these positions, but I also think we need to be careful when we're talking about our voting rights, which are absolutely fundamental to the democracy, but not call them sacred rights in ways that might be confusing about what we're actually about when we're doing the people's business in a pluralistic democracy.
I would simply add to that from my perspective, one of the major reasons that has fueled Christian nationalism is the decline of particularly Protestant privilege in the country. And where the changing sociology of Sunday has created a great deal of concern among certain groups of Christians because fewer and fewer people are attending church in general or attending, even for people regularly participating in church, attending intermittently. And COVID didn't help with that.
Yeah.
And so reaching out to the state to protect what the culture used to protect in certain ways and feeling that loss contributes, I think, to many of the things that you've been talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say that impulse, that kind of self-preservation impulse, and an impulse that comes out of a sense of scarcity, certainly not an abundance, it's not an abundant impulse there, it actually is completely counterproductive. And I talk with some actual data in the book about when you look around the world today. I mean, we can talk about history and about the fact that religious observance at the time of the founding was actually quite low because we were coming out of a period of established religion. Guess what? When people are forced to go to church, they don't really want to go very much when they're given the choice. And so we can learn from history, but we can also look around the world today and see examples where places do have established religion and their actual rates of religious observance and religious belief, as far as they can measure it, are lower than in places that don't have established religion. So their own efforts at self-preservation will be self-defeating in the end if they get their way.
And your last point is extremely important in terms of thinking that will increase church participation when actually it declines from that. Which brings us to church-state separation, long a theme and focus of the Baptist Joint Committee. And I think it's important for you to lay out, as you do in the book, the meaning of church-state separation within the context of religious liberty and the First Amendment.
Yeah. So I do have a whole chapter on defending the separation of church and state and understanding what it is and how it protects religious freedom because it is so misunderstood. I'm really not trying to pick on Speaker Johnson, but I will say that he has been a very loud proponent, and as he claims the mantle of being a constitutional lawyer, he says basically that church-state separation doesn't exist. Some of his colleagues have said the same thing. And in fact, it does exist, and it is an incredibly important way to protect everyone's religious freedom. So in our constitutional system, we started with just the US Constitution itself. And the US Constitution makes no mention of God, makes no mention of Christian or Jesus, and its only mention of religion is in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office. So my favorite rebuttal to people who claim that America is a Christian nation is to say, you know, the framers of the Constitution were really brilliant men, and if they wanted to create a Christian nation, this is about the most ineffective way I could possibly think of them creating a Christian nation, to say from the very beginning there will be no religious tests for public office. Because of course that's not what they were creating. They were creating a secular government in which religion would be left for the people to determine and for the people to support the religious houses of worship and other religious institutions. And then, of course, 4 years after the US Constitution, we had the Bill of Rights. And there was concern that religious freedom was not sufficiently protected under the new US Constitution. And so the first 16 words of the First Amendment are, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Of course, freedom of religion is the first of 5 freedoms that are protected in the First Amendment. But religious freedom is protected by 2 clauses, the No Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And this arrangement is what goes by the shorthand separation of church and state. Now, naysayers will say, separation of church and state is not in the US Constitution. Well, religious freedom, so neither is separation of powers, right? Those words, separation of powers, are not in the US Constitution, but that's what the whole framework does. In the same way, the First Amendment sets up a framework of the separation of church and state that is protected by these 2 clauses. And so in the book, I give examples from the founding period that is indeed how the framers and the people at the time, and even Alexis de Tocqueville, who came and of course wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, that everyone at the time knew it as separation of church and state. This is not some liberal creation of the last 50 years. But we know that this separation of church and state has never been absolute. We have always had the involvement of religious people in our democracy, and I argue that that's a very good thing. You know, we don't have like a French system which decides to separate religion and government to such an extent that religious language and religious participation is really shunned from the public square. Rather, we have a robust religious sector that engages, continually in the public square. But that does make it incumbent on all of us to be sure that the Christian majority, the Christian privilege, the Christian supremacy, frankly, that we have in our culture, does not overtake the rest of the religious life in this country to such an extent that we undercut that founding promise that belonging in the United States would never depend on one's religious identity. I think that that is the ideal that is included in the US Constitution, but it's an ideal that we have fully yet to realize. And so we have to, as we think about this, the ways that religion and government relate to one another, we have to be mindful, I think, of that being our goal. And another piece of this that I do write about is that the question cannot be simply, is it constitutional? I think that we've gotten to a point in this country that we think anything that's constitutional is a good idea. And that's simply not the case. As a lawyer, I can tell you the law is often the lowest common denominator, right? If we only go about doing what's legal and not asking ourselves, is this the right thing to do, then we're not going to want to live in this society much longer. Particularly when the US Supreme Court continues to, I believe, misinterpret the First Amendment in ways that have expanded the Free Exercise Clause, diminished the No Establishment Clause, in ways that are really undercutting religious freedom for all people.
That's wonderfully stated. You and I both admire very, very greatly the colonial preacher, Roger Williams, who came to this country in 1630 as a Puritan preacher, but was very quickly thrown out of Christian Nationalist Massachusetts because he said several things. One, he said, the Native Americans are the sole owners of the American land and should be justly compensated for it. Could I get an amen from you?
Amen.
Secondly, he said, there are no Christian nations, only Christian people bound to Christ not by citizenship, but by faith. Mm-hmm. The Baptists can say amen to that here tonight, at least. And third, he said, contrary to popular opinion, Jews and what he called Turks, meaning Muslims, make fine neighbors like everybody else does and should not be punished for their religious belief. He particularly wanted to be clear that God alone is judge of conscience. And neither the state or an official established church can judge the conscience of the heretic, the people who believe the wrong stuff, or the atheists, the people who believe not at all in a particular religion. This is, and he lived for a time. He invented Providence, Rhode Island, after the Puritans threw him out. And for a time, he lived with the Native Americans and bought land from the Narragansetts, and wrote the first treatise on the Native American language called The Keys to the Language of America in 1640. And he writes much of it in verse, and I couldn't go without sharing this, my favorite part of the verse. When Indians see the lying ways of cruel English men, their taunting notes their murders great, then say these Indians then, we wear no clothes, have many gods, and yet our sins are less. You are barbarians, pagans wild, your land's the wilderness. Mm-hmm. How did Roger Williams in 1640 see what some of our relatives and friends and politicians in America can't see 400 years later? Mm-hmm. Christian nationalism and the public schools. Yeah. 10 Commandments on the walls of schools, every school in Louisiana. But now they're having to put asterisks by thou shalt not give false witness. And every public school teacher in Oklahoma required to be able to teach a class in Bible. Talk about Christian nationalism in public schools, Amanda.
So those two examples were too late for me to include in my book, but I do have an entire chapter. You know, we can talk about how Christian nationalism is infecting and impacting a lot of different public policy issues. But I chose public schools to focus on, one, because they impact everyone. You know, whether or not you have kids or grandkids in public schools now, 90% of America's children are educated in public schools. This is our future of our country. And of course, our tax dollars support them as well. So we all have a stake in what's happening in America's public schools. Two, there is a concerted effort by the movement of Christian nationalism to target public schools with these policies. And that's because the public polling shows people aren't born with the ideas of Christian nationalism. They have to be indoctrinated into them. And so there is a particular effort to push this in public schools, in part for the very reason you said earlier. The idea being, well, if they're not going to go to church on Sunday, we'll just make sure they get Bible Monday through Friday in the public schools. And so we have efforts that started several years ago, first with just the posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools. "In God We Trust" is the national motto. But it's only been the national motto since the 1950s, which was a prior high tide of Christian nationalism during McCarthyism and all of those early days of the Cold War. The same period when "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Examples of civil religion, again, that just lead to this kind of constant hum of Christian nationalism, this daily reminder in our heads that to be an American means to be a Christian. Often they have window dressing of inclusion by saying it's all about Judeo-Christian values. But just hear how in trying to appear inclusive, they're actually being quite anti-Semitic in the process. Because there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian religion. They're reducing Judaism to just a modifier of Christianity. It is another form of Christian supremacy to even talk about Judeo-Christian values. But this is the false rationale that they give for things like the posting of the Ten Commandments. You know, I have no problem with the Ten Commandments, I just don't think they should be posted in public schools or taught in public schools the way that they're being taught here, because the rationale, they say, is that the Ten Commandments is the basis of all American law. Have you heard that before, the Ten Commandments? That is not true, right? They just keep saying over and over again to the point that it sounds true. Right, but that's what we will hear as the reason that one can't be a good American citizen if one doesn't know the Ten Commandments. I agree that the Ten Commandments are a good set of rules to orient our lives by, but they are not contingent upon being a good American citizen to know the Ten Commandments, particularly not the official government version of the Ten Commandments, which is, by the way, an edited version of the King James Bible that came out. I really call them the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments. Because that particular version is the version that's on some of those big monuments that are around the country that were put there by a fraternal order to publicize the movie The Ten Commandments in the 1950s. Wow. Right, so in 1960s. So there's Hollywood is involved in all of this, but a lot of people don't know that. And that's, again, the problem. The problem being not just this signal that's being sent, sometimes in ways that are not at all subtle, to America's children, that they don't fully belong if they don't have a given religious identity, in ways that really interfere with these kids' religious freedom rights and the religious freedom rights of their families, but also in the way that our religion is being a particular version of religion is being assumed as the official religion by the US government, an idea that was firmly rejected in the founding document of this country in ways that we would not establish religion. We are literally going backwards when we're doing these projects. But you talk also about what's happening in Oklahoma. There, the state superintendent of education, Ryan Walters, this summer issued an edict, and it was, we've talked about this on our podcast previously, it was days after Louisiana issued or signed their law that they would have the Ten Commandments. They didn't want to be one-upped by Louisiana. So the edict literally reads, "We will teach the Bible, comma, which includes the Ten Commandments," in case anybody didn't know. We're teaching Ten Commandments too in Oklahoma, but we're going to teach it by requiring that every public school classroom have a Bible and that teachers teach out of the Bible in courses like history and civics, because they say you can't understand the US Constitution without understanding the Bible. Again, secular document, no mention of the Bible, no mention of Christianity. And so again, sending this signal of full belonging. And then as we've come to find out, the Bibles that they are instructing to be bought are not just any Bibles, but a King James version of the Bible that includes the founding documents in the Bible themselves. So this is textbook, literally textbook Christian nationalism, this thorough merging of American and Christian identities. And as it turns out, there was exactly one Bible that met those specifications, something called the God Bless the USA Bible, which was the only Bible endorsed by President Trump, which I said, when we talked about this previously, I said, I don't think the Bible needs anyone's endorsement. But it's not only endorsed by Trump, but he personally receives royalties on every Bible that's sold. So we see this really cynical undercurrent of personal profit motive that's also driving some of these policies.
October 31st is the 507 year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. What you've just explained is why the selling of indulgences ain't over yet.
Yeah.
How's our time? 5 minutes. I was going to ask you to talk about Jesus, but that's not enough time. Really quickly, with Jesus we can get 10 minutes. That's wonderful, I tell you. This is a Baptist church. Because these three churches brought us all together, talk about, as you conclude the book, your advice for, and this is a quote, what churches are allowed to do in the public square, in the political square.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role that religious institutions can and should play. I think we see examples of some churches, many of which are fully bought into Christian nationalism, where the worship service looks much more like a partisan campaign rally, where you have pastors openly endorsing candidates from the pulpit, where politicians are coming to give campaign speeches. One prominent Baptist church in my town of Dallas, Texas, has an annual Patriotic Sunday around the 4th of July, where the pastor and the church have taken out billboards that say America is a Christian nation, and that they'll have American flags passed out to every congregant, and it's full of patriotic songs. So we have examples, I think, clearly of what not to do. I think sometimes churches that are interested in really pushing back against Christian nationalism might veer too far the other way. Might say, I don't want to divide my congregation. I don't want to talk about politics at all in church. I don't want to get involved in the life of the public square because I'm afraid my tax status might be under threat. And so I explain in the book that there are all kinds of legal ways that don't jeopardize 501c3 status, for religious institutions to be actively involved in the democracy. And I think it's critical that all institutions and all individuals be actively engaged in the democracy. I think that our national country, that the country as a whole is on the verge of authoritarianism. And I think there are many places in this country that are already well down the road to authoritarianism, including the state of Texas, where I live. And so when I talk to crowds, I say, we will only live in an authoritarian regime if we act like we live in an authoritarian regime. And as long as we have legal protections of a democracy, we have to use every piece of our democratic rights and our processes that we can. We are sitting here a week before a national election. Every person who's eligible needs to vote and help someone else to vote. But it's not just happening around elections. How do we get more actively engaged in things that are going on in our local school boards, in our legislatures? And I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like in practice in Texas. We had a law, first of its kind law that passed from Texas last year that goes by the name the School Chaplain Law. It says that it encouraged school districts to either hire or accept as volunteers school chaplains, and sometimes to replace mental health counselors. You may ask, what's a school chaplain? There probably are chaplains in the audience here. I am a big supporter of chaplaincy in the right context, in the military, in hospitals, in prisons, in places where people's access to their faith, practice of their faith is somehow limited. That a chaplain who is properly licensed and trained to help that person follow their faith in that critical moment, that is a really critical piece of ministry. That is not what's happening with the school chaplain law. In the law in Texas, a school chaplain is defined as anyone who can pass a criminal background check. No licensing requirement, no special training, no ability to work with children, no limit on what the person can say, the school chaplain can say to kids. The proselytizing is okay. And in Texas, they even rejected an amendment that would have required parental consent. And so once that happened, the only good thing about this law is it didn't immediately take effect. Instead, the decision-making went then to every school district in Texas, all 1,200 of them, which then had 6 months to decide whether or not they would start a school chaplain program. And at that point, we at Baptist Joint Committee, working with a number of different groups, we first went to chaplains. And we told them about the law, and we organized a letter from more than 300 licensed professional chaplains who said that they did not approve of this law. They said they were offended that they would cheapen their own professional credentials by misdefining chaplaincy in this way, and also explained how the public school context was not the correct context for chaplains. And so for most Texans, the first time they learned about this law was the headline in their local paper that said, "School chaplains don't want chaplain law." And then we helped train people to go to their school boards, including a number of people who are religious leaders at different churches, to go and talk to their school board members about why they were concerned about having a school chaplain law that's defined in this way in their school boards. And out of all 1,200 districts in Texas, I know of one that voted to have a school chaplain program. So that is the active involvement of the faith community in pushing back against authoritarian measures that threaten religious freedom of our neighbors. And sadly, we are all going to have opportunities to do that kind of democratic advocacy, small d democratic advocacy, in our own contexts. And I think it's incumbent on us to work together and to figure out what is impacting the rights and freedoms of the people in our community, and what can we do, particularly those of us who are part of a Christian majority, especially white Christians, who have, even sometimes without even reaching out and getting it, we have benefited from white Christian nationalism in our culture. How do we then take the responsibility of pushing back and helping create a more equitable place for all of our neighbors, regardless of religion, race, creed, ethnicity, or any other line of difference?
That was an excellent way to end this conversation tonight. And I know everyone wants to thank you for the insights that you have brought to us this evening.
questions, but we only have time for 6. We want to thank everyone for submitting questions in advance. I will begin with question number 1 for Amanda and Bill. The first question is there an effective way to persuade those with Christian nationalist beliefs to see the incongruent nature between the United States and any church as national authority?
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm going to kind of quibble with some of the premises there that I talk some in the book about. The question was, how do we persuade Christian nationalists? One important distinction I write about in the book is I don't call people Christian nationalists. I don't view Christian nationalism as an immutable characteristic. It's not a diagnosis. It's not something you have or you don't have. It's an ideology and a cultural framework that we each have daily and probably many times a day opportunities to either embrace or reject. And so I think it's also, and I talk about some of the public polling and show kind of how prevalent Christian nationalism is in different, among the American population. And it turns out that the majority of Americans, like 60%, are somewhere in the middle. We're either resisting or accommodating Christian nationalism, but we aren't fully bought in and we haven't fully rejected it. And so I think it creates more space, including for our own self-reflection, if we think about it more like racism, as we think about it as something that's just part of the culture, and we have to kind of grapple with how we are relating to it ourselves. And then the second piece is, I don't think if we're really trying to talk with someone about it, it's not going to be very effective if we go in saying, I'm going to logically change this person's mind about Christian nationalism. Rather, I think it's about just having conversations with people that we're in relationship with. And how do we humbly and authentically listen to the person that we're talking with and try to understand where they're coming from. We don't have to, and I don't think we should, endorse their ideas on it, but we can better understand how they came to the ideas, and over a course of a relationship, not a single conversation, have some sense of really growing together away from Christian nationalism. I do think it's best done in personal conversation, not in social media posting, and with people that we actually know and are in relationship with, though I acknowledge that sometimes those are the hardest conversations to have. It's easier to just argue with someone that we don't know and we might not ever meet in person.
There's a word that I think fits with exactly what Amanda was saying, and that is the word witness. One simply decides to declare, often as a dissenter, one's views, but to offer an openness to people who disagree with us that tries, if at all possible, to keep the doors of conversation and human relationship open. And that's very difficult at this moment in time in the country, which is why I think it's so important for us to cultivate or recultivate that kind of humane, and those of us who are Christian would say gospel witness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Our next question has 2 parts. What is the relationship between white Christian nationalism and white evangelical Christianity? And the second part is, can one be a conservative within the current American religious and political landscape and reject Christian nationalism?
Yeah. Well, I'll take this. Yes, absolutely. Having conservative views does not make one an ambassador of Christian nationalism. And I think that's critical that we recognize that. This isn't about having the right religion. This isn't about just rejecting a conservative religion and installing progressive Christianity into power. This is rather about saying that no one's religious beliefs that have a right to having primacy in law and policy. Now, and the reason I call it Christian nationalism usually and not white Christian nationalism, even though white supremacy is baked into Christian nationalism in the American context, is that I think calling it white Christian nationalism suggests that one has to be white to embrace it. And that's just not the case. The polling shows that people from all ethnic, all racial, all religious groups, there's some percentage of them who do embrace Christian nationalism as ambassadors of Christian nationalism. But the group that by percentage has the highest number of ambassadors of Christian nationalism are white evangelical Christians. And I think that is, and this is kind of more maybe in Bill's areas of expertise, but this is over several decades of, I think, a co-opting of certain religious movements in this country by political movements in ways that evangelical has ceased to be as much of a religious distinction as it is a political label.
And one of the real difficulties for persons who have used the title evangelical is that this group, which early on in American history placed an emphasis on conversion and on spirituality and on growing into faith, the changes and and this I know is a much used word, but the authoritarianism of that emphasis often drives more people, as Amanda has said, drives more people away from faith across the religious perspective than it does embracing them. And I think that's becoming self-evident, and it's very sad to see for what it is doing to religious communities themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And our third question picks up on where you left off with that. To what extent is today's Christian nationalism simply a latter-day manifestation of early 20th century Christian/Baptist fundamentalism?
That's for you.
A couple of things. Fundamentalism dates from the late 19th century. There's always been a particular fundamentalist emphasis within Christianity, with an emphasis on particular dogmas that are non-negotiable. But as a movement, the post-Civil War era saw the beginnings of a particular approach that came to be called fundamentalist because certain doctrines were non-negotiable and defined very precisely as very much the only definition of Christianity. And that came to the point where it was so controversial and so uninviting that certain conservative Christians began to call themselves, Billy Graham being a centerpiece of that, started to call themselves not fundamentalists, but evangelicals. It was an in-between word for defining a conversionist emphasis on heart religion and Christian spirituality. But fundamentalism as such has never been dormant and has become, for many Christian communities, Jewish communities, Muslim communities as well, with simply the term, a defining element of those religions. And that's, in this country, that's really become a major emphasis within evangelicalism. I'll simply add just two names. Peter Weiner, who writes extensively for the Atlantic magazine, and David French, who writes weekly columns for the New York Times, are card-carrying, self-acknowledged evangelicals. But they have parted company with the kind of evangelicalism that tends to move toward Christian nationalism with a kind of dogmatism. And they've suffered a great deal of denunciation by the people who were some of their closest friends in terms of spiritual connection. But if you've not read them, I would encourage you to do so, because they maintain their particular conservative theological emphases, but not with the hardcore dogmatism of the present fundamentalist Christian nationalist orientation.
Mm-hmm. Our next question is about violence. In light of recent events, is Christian nationalism okay with violence if it's in the name of God?
Yes. Yeah. And I have a whole chapter in the book about violence. We didn't get to Jesus, Bill, but
That's right.
but Jesus, was nonviolent, right? And when we look at the gospel, really all of Christian nationalism, just like the Christian nation mythology cherry picks American history, Christian nationalism really has to cherry pick the Bible in order to claim any kind of Christian label. And most of the verses that they rely on are from some of the more violent passages of the Old Testament, and also a real misreading of the armor of God passage from the epistles. And so they take some of this violent imagery in the Bible and use it to justify their own use of violence to gain and hold on to power at any cost. And I think some of the most dramatic examples of that many of us saw for the first time it was on January 6, 2021. In the way that Christian nationalism provided a permission structure for violence and really intensified the violence on that day. But that language has just been repeated over the last 4 years. Of course, we see white supremacists who use the Christian nationalism, again, as part of their rationale for committing mass murder in the form of mass shootings. But we also see it in militias that are gaining force in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And as I write about in the book, the Reawaken America tour, which is this traveling road show of violence, conspiracy theories, election denialism, and Christian nationalism. That tries to use the language of Christianity to build a well-armed group of people who are ready to take over the government when the call is made. And I think, to kind of have a chilling moment here, but I think we have to be aware of the specter of violence, particularly as we're leading up to this election and whatever happens in its aftermath.
And that really does bring us to Jesus. It really does. One of the great challenges that the Christian religion in America is facing is, how do we understand the life and mission of Jesus of Nazareth? Mm-hmm. And because of the turmoil in the culture, using at many points religious language, the voice and the witness and the meaning of Jesus is being lost across the theological and ideological spectrum. And I think if Amanda and I had one word tonight with a group of persons, many of whom, not all, are Christians, it would be one of the things you might consider doing in your home congregation is to revisit the meaning of Jesus, now, past and present, and future. because we have seen in the history of the Christian church, the meaning of Jesus can get lost very easily. And when it is, it's very hard to reform that ideology into the life of the Spirit.
We are a few weeks away from Thanksgiving, where many of us will sit around tables with our wonderful family members who may not agree with our perspectives on this. So the question is, how do I navigate oppositional relatives in regards to Christian nationalism? Maybe not at the Thanksgiving table, but just in general.
Yeah, I think I spoke some of the tips I had earlier on how to engage in conversation, I think apply equally to our family members. And yeah, I don't know that I'd try to do this over turkey and pumpkin pie, but I also think when we were talking just a moment ago about what do we think, how do we really focus on Jesus? If I had to sum it up in one word, it's love.
Yes.
And so these people who are in our families, whom we love, how do we show that love of neighbor to them in ways that we can help them and through it ourselves as well, walk away from this poisonous ideology? How do we call them in to living our faith in ways that show love for our neighbor by pushing back against Christian nationalism? So I just think I don't have like a magic word, this is exactly how you do it. I do talk about some other tips in the book, but I think it's just to encourage everyone to have that brave conversation and to center it in the love that we have for them and for each other.
Yeah. I grew up like Amanda. I grew up in Texas, and my grandmother, who was formidable in my life, was a member of the Fundamental Baptist Church in Decatur, Texas, with a big neon anchor out front flashing Jesus Saves 24/7. And she's one of the greatest Christians I have ever known. And when I got my first teaching job, it was at a Baptist seminary in Louisville that was perceived to be highly liberal then. And someone in her church got wind of that, and she told my grandmother, "Billy's gone liberal." And my grandmother said, "Well, I don't know what a liberal is, but if Billy's one, I guess it's all right." And and I come back to that. There are a lot of people who don't think that about me, but I come back to that as a way in which families can find together the spirit of love that drew us and draws us, and that is deeper even than some of our most adamant dogmas. Because of that, when people start getting on my case, I just think about Grandma.
Our last question. It's a two-parter. It says, how hopeful are you that we can prevent Christian nationalists from controlling our government? And perhaps I'm feeling not so hopeful, so I'm going to add the second part, which is, what brings you hope in this conversation?
Yeah. Well, I already said, that people who embrace Christian nationalism have already overtaken the Texas government. So I don't think that, I think we're in an active process. I also talked about how someone who's embracing Christian nationalism is the Speaker of the House. So I think we're we're already down that road.
Yes.
Yes. But I do have hope, because the majority of Americans don't want that kind of system. I mean, that's the deal, is this Christian nationalism is fundamentally anti-democratic. We would have to change the rules of the game, and people are actively trying to do that in order for it to be a total takeover into authoritarian theocracy. And the hope that I get, and I do write about, is like tonight, is that all of you showed up when you could be doing a lot of other things, like watching the World Series, which is what I'd like to be doing right now too, and came to have this conversation. And this is being replicated in places all over the country. As I go on this book tour, as I've had over the past 5 years, there are so many more of us who care about taking on Christian nationalism by sheer numbers than people who are wanting to take over the government with it. The problem is the people who want to take over the government with Christian nationalism have more power and more money. But we have more people power. And so how do we band together in our people power, organize for change, and do something active about it? And you are doing something active about it by being here tonight, and so I thank you.
I think that's wonderfully said. I would add two things. One is, as Amanda has said, we have to cultivate the witness we've been talking about tonight and hold to it, and if necessary, learn how to be dissenters in a nation where an unofficial, official religious establishment becomes the norm. We have to find out how to live like that. And that's my second point. We cannot, 1 week from this election, suppose that that reality is not going to become national policy in the land of the free and the home of threats against FEMA workers and librarians and election poll employees. So we have to know that on the other side of Tuesday, this may be a very different nation than it even is tonight, and prepare ourselves for that. And I would suggest, if you have an opportunity, and you have only one book to read, you might consider reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers from Prison. And get ready for the future, potentially, and hopefully not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm Sylvia Oberle, a member of the planning team, and I've been asked to take a few minutes for a call to action after tonight's event. And I think, frankly, we've had 45 minutes of a wonderful call to action. So once again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure realistically what I can add, except just to say, as you have said so well, that education and understanding are the most important action steps. And in the conversation that we've just heard, we have learned a lot about what led to the growth of Christian nationalism and what we need to do to counter it, to think about it, to learn about it, and to educate ourselves. I encourage you to continue learning and spreading that information. Tonight's conversation is being recorded, and each of you will receive a link to the recording after tonight. We encourage you to share this with at least 5, 10 other people to help them understand what went on here tonight. This event also is going to be part of the Respecting Religion podcast, so please be on the lookout for that as well. On the back of your program, we have some other very practical things for you to do. One is to pay attention to the Baptist Joint Committee's website. I spent a lot of time in the last week or so really digging deep into that website. There's so much information there about materials, curriculum, action items that are open to all. So we encourage you to look at that and share that with others. The other thing is that we do encourage you to sign the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement that is on the website that's mentioned on the back, and also you can link through the QR code on the back of your program. This will take you to a web page where you can learn more about the endorsers of this statement from multiple denominations, from media platforms, religious liberty advocates, and it is an impressive list of people at the forefront of this counter movement. The statement itself has been signed already by more than 40,000 people across the country. We encourage you to read, to reflect on this statement, and if you so are inclined, to sign it yourselves. We also encourage you to gain awareness of, as Amanda said and as Bill echoed, what is happening actively in our public square. It's happening, these ideologies are being imposed upon public bodies every day across the country, as you've heard tonight, in our state and in our city. Just last week, our local school board was asked to return to non-secular prayer at the beginning of school board meetings to replace the current moment of silence. Multiple speakers accused board members of kicking God out of every aspect of our public schools and admonishing them for not seeking God's wisdom and guidance in making educational decisions. The board voted 6-3 to retain the moment of silence, but not before members were publicly shamed for what they were called ignoring and insulting God. If you are so inclined, we encourage you to email board members to thank them for standing for liberty and freedom for people to express their faith in whatever way they feel so inclined. If this is not the way that you think policy discussions should go before public bodies full of Christian nationalism ideologies, then we hope you will become aware of what's at stake daily, here locally and elsewhere. Amanda's book lays out specific steps. In particular, step 5, I think, is a really good way to talk about taking on Christian nationalism close to home. And you've already talked about that in terms of the people that you are close to, your family members, and just have those honest, authentic conversations. So we encourage you to do that. Finally, as a follow-up to tonight's event, Ardmore Baptist will be hosting a discussion of Amanda Tyler's book starting on Thursday, November 14th. That discussion group is open to the public, and further details will be emailed to registrants of tonight's event, and we'll make sure that you also get that. We also have one more opportunity at the narthex here, a group here called Forsyth Resists Project 2025, talking about the impacts on church and state. Happy to share some of that information with you in the narthex. So thank you for considering these opportunities. Thank you again. You gave us the call to action tonight. Thank you very much.
After the program, right outside the sanctuary in the narthex, books will be on sale, and Amanda will be signing books. So if you would like to purchase a book or have her sign your book, please line up, and the line will come from the narthex down this right-hand aisle through the sanctuary. It's my great pleasure to say thank you to you both, Amanda and Bill. Thank you for your work, past, present, and future, with your words and with your actions. Thank you for your witness, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you for deepening our understanding and for giving us forward steps to take. And thank you for giving us hope. Let's express our gratitude to them. Go now in peace and keep hope as a light burning within you. Good evening.